first become aware of your family's business?
I first became aware of my family's business when I was probably about between the ages of 2 and 3 years old, actually, though I might not have associated it as their business, but I knew what the environment was because we were still living in Chicago. We didn't move to New York until I was about 3 and a half, and my dad went to Paramount. But we were still living in Chicago, so there was Balaban and Katz theaters. And I do remember, even now, I have a sense memory of being taken to the theater, in the back of the theater, and waiting for my dad to come down from the office at the end of the day if we were all going to go to a family dinner or something. Now, we didn't do that a lot because in those days you didn't take your 2.5-year-old kids out to dinner a lot. But I do remember being in this sort of magical place that was darkened with these big images of pictures. It was very mysterious to me because I was a baby. I didn't even know what it was really, but I knew it was something special and magical.
Where did your family first make their home?
When I was born, my parents were living at 3400 Lakeshore. And it was a big, large apartment in Chicago, which my father, I think, had lived in even before he and my mother married. I think he lived there and he had moved his mother in with him. And then my parents got married, and my brother Bert was adopted because he was my mother's child from her first marriage. And then my brother Leonard was born, and then I came along in 1932, and they were living at 3400 Lakeshore in Chicago.
We can hear him outside.
Okay.
Do you want to?
Why don't you be the bad guy and just ask him to please be quiet?
Right.
We're not going to tell him we're not going to be doing this for very long.
This way is probably easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell them they have to really cool their jets now, that they can go back in later if they want.
Now, did John's family live close by to you?
You know, I don't know. No, when I was there years later, when I went back for somebody's funeral, John lived, I think, on Michigan or maybe down Lakeshore further or something, but not in that building, I don't think. Sorry,
Okay,
I don't really know.
For a second. Just talk a little bit, just to make sure. Go ahead.
Okay, recollections about Chicago, which I don't have that
Okay.
many of.
All right, good. So let's just do if we don't mind doing the last question again. So,
Got an airplane now.
Yeah.
well,
I'm being a sound guy.
No, you have
the
to.
last answer was there a lot of kids' noise in the back?
No, not. I couldn't tell if I was hearing it through here or.
I don't mind doing it over if you want to do it
Okay,
over.
well, we'll just to be safe. So.
Very, very simple to do it over. Now, not easy to do it over after you've left.
Yeah. Hmm.
Having a documentary, I know what that's about.
So Judy, where did your family first make their home?
When I was born, my first home with my family was at 3400 Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. It was a large apartment, which I have little recollection of because we moved away when I was 3 and a half and moved to New York when my father went to Paramount. But it was a very large apartment my father had moved into and had moved his mother into. And then when he met my mother and they married, she, of course, moved in as well with her son, my brother Bert, who my father then adopted. Then my brother Leonard was born shortly after, maybe a year or so after they married. And then 3 years later, I was born. So that was our first home in Chicago, was 3400 Lakeshore Drive.
And what did you see? I'm going to ask them to be quiet.
No, they're, yeah. No, I'm going to. You want me to ask them?
Okay. No, don't worry about it.
Just tell them they have to come out of the
Yeah,
pool if
please
they
stay.
can't be quiet, because just tell them, explain that they can go back in later. That just, I told them they had to be quiet when this was happening, so.
Guys, I don't want to be a bad guy, but I need to be quiet. And I'm not trying to be harsh, but I think amplify the sound, okay? I really appreciate it. I'm really talking to myself.
There's curtains to pull there. There's not.
No. Now we've got a telephone ringing. It'll go about 4 times and then the machine will get it.
Being a teacher, I sometimes overdo being the bad guy.
No, you weren't. You were very gentle with them. I would have been much, but they're mine, you know.
Okay.
Now, did you want to refer at all to Maxwell Street or any of that? Because you asked me about the first home, but that was my first home, but that certainly wasn't.
Well, there is a question about your grandparents.
Okay.
So so it's not, the questions aren't really necessarily in order.
No. You cut them however you cut them.
What memories do you have of when your family moved to New York?
My family moved to New York when I was 3.5 in the summer. And I do remember that we moved to this extraordinary property in New City, New York, which was euphemistically, called the farm, and it was Adolf Zucker's summer home. In those days, the heads of movie companies who lived in New York, Adolf Zucker, Marcus Lowe, so forth, they used to play sort of can you top this with houses, and one would build one and then another one would build a bigger one. And then the other one would say, well, I can top that, and then he'd build an even bigger one. So this was, Marcus Lowe had built an enormously splashy place on the North Shore of Long Island, and Adolf Zucker built this 400-acre farm with a full golf course, 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools, 2 tennis courts. We lived in the guest house, which was 32 rooms, because the main house my mother felt was not cozy, and that was about 60 rooms. And she was right, it wasn't cozy. I mean, I remember the guest house, the enormous 32-room house. It also had a gardener's house on the property, and it had what was called the party house. And the party house had a bowling alley downstairs and ping pong rooms. On the main floor, it had sort of a dining hall sort of thing. And it had a separate movie theater house. That was a separate house, the theater. But upstairs in the party house was a sort of miniature replica of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. I mean, it was very grand. And so it was this huge property, and we used to go off mainly and play, after swimming and so forth, then we'd go walking around picking berries and down in the dell and fishing for, little bunny little fish in the streams and going in the, tea house across the streams and wandering around. We had a great time. But that was the first, then I knew we were in a different place.
Now I have the copy of the home movies that Leonard had given me, and sort of roaming on large property, I guess.
Well, it might be that, or do you want me to continue with how?
Okay.
Do you want me to just?
No, that's all right. We don't have to go too much into that detail.
Well, because I can go to the next houses if you want to.
Yeah, you could tell us a little more about it. Sure.
Okay, so that was where we lived the first 3 summers we were there, 2 or 3 summers, I guess. And in the winter, we lived in the city, in what was Adolf Zucker's Can You Top This apartment, which was a 2-story apartment in the Savoy Plaza Hotel, which was across from the Plaza Hotel. It's now like the General Motors building. F.A.O. Schwartz was there and so forth, but it used to be the Savoy Plaza Hotel. And we had about a 12 or 14 room apartment in that building, which was, a huge apartment, very grand and glorious. Had been Zucker's apartment, and I sort of was raised like Eloise at the Plaza because it was a hotel. I had a great time.
Before we get off the subject, what can you tell us about Israel and Goldie Balaban?
I didn't know my grandparents, Israel and Goldie Balaban, very well. I mean, I knew Israel not at all because the only grandparent of mine on either side that was alive when I was born was Goldie, my grandmother on my father's side. And she died when I was 3. So I have absolutely really no memories of her. I've seen pictures of her at the apartment where we lived when I was under 3 years old, but I don't remember her at all. And she had remarried, which I never knew until some years later I was told that. I do know a wonderful story about her with a little coat. Do you know the little coat story?
No.
My grandmother was a very small woman, Goldie. And apparently my father and all the boys were just devoted to her. She had been a really, sort of carried the family and taught everybody and pushed everybody, and she was really the get-up-and-go person. She had run the store, the fish and produce market that they had in the ghetto in Maxwell Street and all of that. And she's the one who had seen, found movies. And you know that story, I'm sure, about her coming and saying to my father, "You've got to come and see this, Barney. This is incredible." She had a Jewish accent. "Oh, this is so incredible, Barney. You got to come see this business. You got to go into this business right away." So they're riding over on the trolley car to see this storefront kind of first movie theater. And he says, "Why is it such a great business, Mama?" And she said, "Because here they pay the money, and then if they don't like it, it's too bad. They already paid." Because she was used to, a fish and produce market where they came and they pushed their fingers in all the fruit and they left dents, and then they said, "No, I don't want it," or they bought it and didn't pay the bill. Well, she thought any business where they plunk the money down and that's the end of it was like, her idea of heaven, which turned out to be, I'm sure, true. Anyway, but the great story about her with the coat was that, as I said, my father was devoted to her, and at one morning at breakfast, he and my mother and my grandmother were having breakfast in the apartment at Lakeshore. And my grandmother said to my father that it was getting cold, which it was in Chicago. It was autumn, and it was getting cold, and she said, "Bonnie, I need a little coat." So he said, "Well, Mama, have George," it was George Stengel, the chauffeur, "have George take you down to Marshall Field and buy a little coat. I mean, it's winter." She said, "Thank you, Bonnie, because it's getting so cold. I don't have a nice little coat. I need a little coat." He said, "Get a little coat, Mama. It's perfect." So that night they're at the dinner table. And he says to her, "Mama, did you go to Marshall Field today?" "Yes." "What did you get?" "Oh, I got a little coat." He said, "Can we see it?" So she gets up from the table, goes to the bedroom, and comes back with a floor-length sable coat. Father said to her, "Mama, I thought you said you were getting a little coat." She said, "It is a little coat, Bonnie. I'm a little woman. What would I do with a big coat?"
Good story.
So I figured, well, that's all I need to know.
That's a good story.
Can I do just one thing?
Okay.
from
Yeah.
you?
Also, even though there are two of us here, it might look best if you look only at
Only
me.
at you.
because
I'm sorry,
people-
yes.
No, just
I
because.
forgot.
No,
Right.
I would,
Sorry.
no, it's fine.
I didn't want to take that off so it doesn't hit her face.
Okay.
How's that?
Yeah, that looks
Is
good.
okay?
Yeah. Can you tone it down a little bit? Because it's a little too much on her hair. Like, just close the, yeah. Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
I pan it off a little.
No.
How's that?
Pan it on to a tiny bit. Okay, good.
There you go.
That's good. Okay. Okay. And did you ever see any shows at any of the Balaban and Katz theaters?
When I was little, I was taken in the back of the theater to wait for my dad to come down from, the office for dinner or something. And I know that there were things happening on the stage, but I was so young, I was under 3.5 years of age, so I don't really remember that. I did, in fact, go back to Chicago later and saw some movies and one stage show at the Chicago Theater, but I don't even remember who it was at the time, because by then my dad was at Paramount, and I was seeing so many things at the Paramount Theater,
Well, what did you hear about the Balaban and Katz theaters as far as what made them so special?
Well, one of the things that everybody talked about was the decor, which is now known as early Balaban and Katz, actually. And of course, it was enormously ornate, very Baroque and ornate, and lots of gold, gilded things and whatever. The whole theory, I think, of those theaters being, designed in that way, when the big theaters were built in those years, was very much off of a European tradition. Not that my father was born in Europe or any of his brothers, because they weren't. They were born here. But the sense that if you were going to go out to the movies, which was the new special thing, that it was a very wonderful treat evening out, like going to the opera or the theater had been in European communities where their parents came from. And so I think that generation's parents described to them what those buildings were like. And they very much went off of that style of decorating, because that's where you see all those hugely ornate, grand theater lobbies and red plush seats and gilded chandeliers and things. And that's what they all looked like. They were very, very formal until the Esquire came, which was a much more modern theater that they built later.
How did your father, you described it a little bit before with the little coat story, but how did your father actually get into the movie business?
He actually got into it because his mother told him it was a good business. She had this fish and produce store, on a street called Maxwell Street in Chicago, which was in a Jewish ghetto in Chicago. A great number of rather illustrious people came from there. Bill Paley, who founded CBS, his family came from there. They were cigar makers in Maxwell Street. Barney Ross, the fighter, Admiral Rickover. There were a number of people who came out of Maxwell Street that later made great successes in life. But my grandmother had 10 children, 8 of whom lived, 2 died in childbirth or shortly thereafter. And she and her husband and the 8 surviving children lived in about 2 rooms above a fish and produce market in Maxwell Street. And her life was, of course, plagued with the fact that her neighbors had no money, and she was, generous person, and so she'd let people buy things on credit, and then, of course, they couldn't pay. But the stuff was out of the store already. They had it. Or people would come in and they'd poke around the fruit and the vegetables, and then they'd leave dents in it, and then they wouldn't buy it and whatever. So these were her 2 economic, hardships running the store. So she saw this business where people got in a line and they put money down, and then they went in and got the product. Whether they liked it or not was academic. They had already put the money down. They weren't getting refunds. That was it. So to her, that was a sort of brilliantly structured business to be in economically. And she went and dragged my father from his job at Western Coal Storage Company one day and said, Barney, you have to come and see this business where they put the money down before they get the stuff, And he thought that was a good business as well. So he and his brothers and his sister, Ida, all started with these almost Nickelodeon kind of, early theaters where one of them would take the tickets, one of them would play the piano, one of them would sweep up after the show, one of them would run the projector, and they were silent films. So there was the playing of the piano to accompany the film and the words, the text that was on the screen, because people weren't speaking. They were just on what little dialogue there was on the text cards. And the theater would be darkened. It would be pitch black and quite stuffy because the windows had to be closed for sound and darkened for the images on the screen. And in those days, it was just a business you could only operate in the cooler or cold months of the year, because in the summer it was just too hot to be in those theaters.
Okay, and what was...
Because in the summer it was just too hot to be in those theaters.
Okay, and what made your father such a special person, and why do you think he was so successful in business?
My father was an odd mix to be in the business he was in a sense, because he was he loved movies and he loved the theater business and the motion picture business, but his interest really in it was as a business which could present entertainment to the public. He did not consider himself, unlike many of the other heads of studios, he did not consider himself to be the creative show person, as it were. He considered it was his job to run the business well so that people who had that instinct and flair could be, with being accountable and all, but then make the product and then it was up to, him to either exhibit it, distribute it, whatever all of that was, and oversee the production, but not in a hands-on way. He never had anything to do really directly with production. And he was a mathematical genius. He didn't go past, I think, 6th grade in school, but he was extremely well-read. I think we have to stop because it's my gardener.
You know what? Would you do me a favor, Dan?
Yeah.
I have to tell my gardener.
Let me take your mic off.
Yeah, I have to tell the guy. Forgot it's Thursday.
All right.
Sorry.
We're almost like halfway done. Let me just left this. You know what?
That's what you're recording into.
The question was, what made your
Oh, he is
father.
exceptional.
Now, there's kind of like two parts. One part is about what made him a special person, and that's maybe more like reflective of him as a dad. And then the other side is what made him so successful in business.
Do you want to take that from the top
Yeah,
again?
yeah.
Okay. Of course, I think of my father in two ways. One was as my father and a human being, and the other was as a, very successful man who had sort of pioneered in an industry and was able to sustain a very long and active and successful career in it. As a person, it was strange for me because he was 2 generations older than I. He hadn't married until he was 42, and I was the second child that was then born. So actually, by the time he had me, when I was that age, I had grandchildren already. So there was a little bit of a disconnect with us as I grew up about the fact that, his recollections were really from 2 generations earlier, his own childhood. But he was very loving and very sweet. He was a little stern. He had that slight thing of he was darling when we were little. When I was little, he was cozy and cute and fun, and I remember just holding hands with him and sitting on his lap and fishing with him and horseback riding with him. He had me on a horse when I was 3, because he loved to ride, and he loved his boat. So then fishing and all of that. So we all did that together from the get-go. But as we got older,
Okay, let's just pick it up when they finish dragging it.
are they still dragging
Yeah,
the
that's
cake?
all right.
I just want to adjust your coat here a little bit on this side. It's kind of lumped up.
Oh yeah,
There you go.
thank you.
There you go.
So I heard it a little bit, but I don't think there was objection, but it got kind of loud at the end. So just like as you, just pick up as
Yes,
you.
but then as we grew up, or as I grew up, I recall, the world was changing. It was becoming more modern. This was pre-World War II and during World War II and post-World War II. And his references were so different. And I think he also, at that point, had a little bit of that thing which men get who are in very successful positions. They're used to having things the way they say they have to be. Not that he was dictatorial or anything, but if they decide it's going to be that way, that's the way it's going to be, if that's in the final analysis. And of course, it's not quite like that with kids, And so I think he was frustrated by the challenges where there would be disagreements from any of us about the way we saw the world or what we thought was right or okay to do or whatever. Although I was given an enormous amount of trust because I was very precocious. I had 2 older brothers. And there were always older boys around and parties and people and whatever, and I was always with grown-ups. My parents always let me visit with the grown-ups. I was never, children should be seen and not heard. And then we, later in life, we had a really wonderful relationship, very, very respectful in both ways and warm and wonderful. As a businessman, he was extraordinary. He was also incredibly principled. I think of him often today when I think about, crony capitalism and a lot of very crooked and manipulative stuff going on that people do for intense amounts of monies that are so much more than anybody needs. Because his theory was, that he was the captain of a ship, the steward of trust for other people's money. He was head of a public company, and he would keep records when he had a telephone, and in his office it was a private phone that he would make his personal calls on so that he got that bill. If he ever had to put a call through the switchboard, that was a personal call, he would inform the operator that it was a personal call and to put it on a separate tab, which he would get at the end of the month, even if it was a 5-cent call to my mother at the house in the country.
I'm concerned about the plane.
Oh.
I just want to wait, if you wouldn't mind.
I don't mind.
That's really key. I think that's amazing. I mean, that's like such a sharp contrast with
Anything.
the world we live in now.
Oh my God.
I mean, but I just want to. That's so cool. I mean, I just.
Oh, he was totally that way.
I mean,
Oh, I
just
know.
feel that is just so.
I remember when other heads of other film companies were sort of known to be maybe manipulating the stock a little bit. He just thought that was like the world's greatest
So tell us
crime.
the story about this being so principled.
So my father was this extraordinarily principled man, and that was personally and professionally. And For example, when he had an office at the Paramount Building in New York in Times Square, and he had a separate telephone line on which he made every single personal call that he made so that he would get the bill for that directly and it would not go through the company. Then if he did have to call through the company line for any reason, through the switchboard, he would let the operator know that it was a personal call, and they would keep a monthly personal call tab for him that he would pay personally, even if it was just to my mother in the country for 5 or 10 cents, which was a toll call in those days. And because he felt that he was, he had a fiduciary responsibility to every single shareholder in the company. And there was a great story around about flying first class, I don't know if you know that, but when there was a sort of a drive to economize at Paramount when television first came in and was, creating some competition for them, and my father instituted this economy drive at Paramount. And one of the things was that nobody would fly first class. So he went to the airport to fly to California from New York. And he was getting on the rear of the plane to go in the coach section. And there were 2 guys from the advertising department going in first class, who then looked and said, "Oh my God, the president of the company is riding coach." He said, "Well, I said we're going to ride coach, and that means all of us." So, but that to him seemed very normal. I mean, he would have been so appalled about the stuff that goes on today. I mean, it would have just been awful for him. And I think most of the brothers, too. I think that's how they operated.
So, without, the purpose of our project is not to focus on the negative aspects, when I mean that, like, I know that some people, there were some challenges, wrinkles that people had in their relationships in terms of the brothers, but what was Barney's relationship with his brothers?
Well, as best I knew, my father's relationship with his brothers was very close. Now, I know there were I'm sure there were problems along the way, one person or another, but he was on the phone to his brothers, as I remembered, almost every day of his life. He talked to everybody a couple of times a week at least. And the only thing that I remember was that our Uncle Abe left B&K, Balaban and Katz, before the Depression. He felt that this was coming on. He wanted out. He took his money out. He sold out, and he went to Europe. And he lived very nicely in Europe during the Depression. And when it was all over, he came back and he wanted his position back with the company in the same way that it had been before, without having to buy back into it or something. I'm not sure of the details. I was a tiny child. And the brothers said, "No, you can't just waltz back in and be put back where you were when you weren't here bearing the hard times with us, And there was a schism in the family for years. So that AJ, or Abe, lived in New York, ran the Roxy, was general manager of the Roxy Theater. He and his wife, Carrie, who was a Christian Scientist in this otherwise all Jewish family. They had 3 children, Ida Joy, who was called Josie, Cherry, and Bruce. And I remember we went to Josie's wedding, her first wedding. So that was probably in the early 40s, perhaps, right around the beginning of World War II, or maybe a little before that. I was a very small child, but I was taken to the wedding. But then there was no contact socially after that between the families. I think my father talked to AJ, though, fairly regularly. And I ran into Bruce when he was at Yale some years later, and then became friendly with the whole family and saw quite a bit of them. But that was a schism that I recall. I don't know about any others. I know that Elmer always had a sense. Elmer, to whom I was, with whom I was very close toward the end of his life, my father's youngest brother, Bob's dad. There was a sense with Elmer that he had been sort of programmed as a young man to go into the family business, and his instincts were that he wanted to be a pianist or a violinist or an artist of some kind. And it was apparently, he held a considerable amount of resentment for most of his adult life that his mother and my father, being the oldest of his brothers and sort of the head male of the family, because I gathered that our grandfather, who had already died by the time I was born, but I gather he was a very sweet man, but a little bit not terribly take charges. So my dad, as the oldest son, probably had that role. Those were the only things I was aware of, if there were other ones before that or whatever. But I know that my dad was on the phone with his brothers constantly, even as I said, when Abe and his family and the rest of the boys and their families were not seeing each other.
What effect did your dad have on your life?
My dad had a really profound effect on my life. He was, first because he was cozy and sweet and fun, and we did things together, even though he was a very busy man and all of that. And then past the teenage years where I was forever doing things that he didn't approve of. And so we sort of were at odds, but still. My dad had this vast and wonderful sense of his citizenship. He had a really deep, abiding love for this country and for the opportunities it had afforded his family when they came here and other families like them. And my father's sense of the American dream was, it was not only what you could take out of America, it was what you were going to be fortunate enough, whatever you had, it was fortunate enough to put back in. And so I was raised with that strong, strong sense of citizenship and political and civic activism and whatever. I don't know if you know that my father was a collector of Americana, a rather well-known collector of Americana. And so I grew up with, in the den was the original manuscript of the words "To My Country 'Tis of Thee," and, letters from George Washington crossing the Potomac, and Mary Todd Lincoln's condolence letter from Queen Victoria, and then Mrs. Lincoln's letter thanking Queen Victoria, and things like that. But at a given point, my father was at the home of the person he bought most of his things from in Philadelphia, who was a very famous collector, but commercial collector. My father was just collecting personally. And he was taken down into the basement, where he was told he would be permitted to see this extraordinary document. And in fact, they went down, and the whole basement had been, refurnished and done and whatever, and padded walls, and there was a special, like a locked vault with special lighting and cooling and whatever. And in that room was one of the 14 original signed copies of the Bill of Rights. When the Bill of Rights was first drafted, 14 copies were signed, one for each of the 13 states and one for the Treasury Department. During the Civil War, one of the states, a southern state, had sold its copy of the Bill of Rights for arms monies to a private party. I don't know whom. Over the years, that copy had wound up in the hands of this man in Philadelphia from whom my dad bought all his Americana. My dad came home and he was so profoundly moved by having seen this thing, but he also said, there's something very wrong with any one person owning this for any reason whatsoever. This belongs to the American people. He then learned that Treasury still had its copy, but that the Library of Congress had no copy, and that the shrine, which housed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, was missing an original copy of the Bill of Rights, because Treasury wouldn't give theirs over. And I think there were 4 or 5 remaining still with different states, but they wouldn't give theirs up either. So my father bought the copy of the Bill of Rights and gave it to the Library of Congress. So when you go to the Library of Congress and you see the shrine, of course they didn't make a copy for the Library of Congress. There was no Library of Congress when they first wrote the Bill of Rights. But when you see the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, that's the copy my dad bought and gave to America. And then after World War II, he was instrumental in founding the Freedom Train, which was a project where a number of rail cars were specially fitted out, and all the great documents were taken from Washington and encased in very special kinds of, things that were built for them. And the Freedom Train went all over America, and the reason for that was that in those days, air travel, we didn't have jet travel yet, so it was long and it was expensive to get around. It took a lot of time and money to get to Washington. So not that many people could afford to go as do now. So the idea was after the war that it would be wonderful to remind people what we had been fighting for by taking these famous documents around. And it was an amazing thing. I was at boarding school in Washington when it came there. The schools would let out for the day, would go to small towns, big cities. All the schools would let out, offices would close. People in all kinds of weather would, line up for 30 blocks, whatever it took, however many people. They'd wait all day long to get in to see it. It was an extraordinary experience. And then a couple of years after that, he found that this man in Philadelphia from whom he had bought his things also owned a copy of...
Hey, your bracelets, it hit the mic.
Sorry.
Okay.
It just happened, right?
It's been off
I'll
and
go
on,
back.
but
I'll go back.
No. Well, it was happening a lot, or just?
Occasionally, every once in a while,
Okay.
when she
I would-
had her hand.
A couple of years later,
Is that someone else's gardener? Probably someone else.
or
right?
it could be a,
I can't hear it in here.
or that could be a plane even.
If you can't hear it in there, then
No.
you can't change the whole planet anyway.
Oh.
Okay, so I wouldn't go back too far because.
Okay, I'm just going to say that a couple of years later, after the Freedom Train and the Bill of Rights, when he bought the Bill of Rights and gave it to the Library of Congress, he came upon also a signed, he realized that this gentleman in Philadelphia owned a signed original of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so he bought that and gave it to the church in Washington where Lincoln had worshipped in a ceremony that the Eisenhowers and my parents attended and whatever. So all of that, I was raised with, I always say, I had a signed photo of Alan Ladd and a copy of the Bill of Rights over my bed when I was a kid. But, that vested in me an enormous sense of the responsibility and the privilege of citizenship. And that's definitely something my father gave to me.
Well, I didn't know a lot of the details, but it's fascinating. How did who did your dad admire in politics?
Well, my initial recollection of that, and I actually wrote about it in a book that came out last year, which was a book about 1936 and people's recollections of those days. Most of the people who wrote for the book were quite illustrious people who are still around, and I had my recollections as well, which they included. But it was election night of 1936, and I remember being in the Paramount building on the 9th floor, standing on the ledge of the window, which was very deep, and they were holding me, of course, and watching the ticker tape and go by in Times Square and giving election results. And my parents explaining to me what an election was about. And of course, it was Franklin Roosevelt. And I remember them talking to me about him.
Okay.
Now it seems to have diminished. So I remember my parents talking to me about Franklin Roosevelt, whom they were very supportive of. Some years later, I think my father voted for Eisenhower. After World War II, yeah.
Welcome to LA.
Yeah.
Helicopters, PD. That's why they work on sound.
Well, we're almost done. We have maybe 5 more questions. What's the name of that book? That sounds really fascinating.
I have it in there. I can't remember. They renamed it, so I can't remember what it was
so
called.
You got up to the point where you said about he made votes for Eisenhower.
Yeah. After World War II, immediately at the end of World War II, the government sent about 20 heads of media corporations to Europe. They commissioned them into the service and gave them, very high rankings and uniforms and everything, although they were not servicemen. My father was way too old to be in the service at that point. But I think he was like a brigadier general or something suddenly for 20 minutes. And they sent them all to Europe. And the purpose of the trip was for them to personally tour concentration camps and other war sites, battle sites, so that they could, in their fields, whether it was press or television, by then we did have some television, radio, film. We had newsreels, of course, we were a big source of news for us at that point, and magazines and so forth, that they could attest to the fact, personally, they could give testimonial to the fact that the things that were said to have happened in Europe did in fact happen, that it was not just propaganda during the war, but that now that the peace was being made and that the history was going to be written and that people would have a sense of what it looked like over there. And it profoundly shook my father. I remember him coming home from having toured concentration camps, and he was beyond shaken. But it also, I think, cemented a relationship between him and President Eisenhower, who was then General Eisenhower. And I believe he did vote for Eisenhower in that period. So I don't know, because, Roosevelt was 4-term president, and then Truman, who my dad voted for, and then Eisenhower, and then I don't know after that, really.
And how did Barney help Paramount to expand?
Well,
that question may not be exactly too apropos in a sense because of, as television came in, there was a lot of changes to the industry, but...
Well, but he was instrumental in television, too,
right.
Because, well, first of all, one of the, most of the motion picture company presidents at that point lived in New York, because during the Depression, the film companies had done all right because it was the only recreation I think anybody could afford. It probably cost a nickel, and that was the only kind of leisure activity anybody could pay for. But in the second crash, which was in October of '32, when I was born, that was the one that hit the movie companies. So they were in a lot of trouble financially, and the banks and money people came out and took a look around what was going on in Hollywood, and they found a tremendous amount of nepotism and irresponsible money management of the businesses, which were perhaps brilliant creatively, but were not so sound financially at that time. So the idea was to position the presidents not as production people in Hollywood, but more as financial managers in New York, near the money markets, near the investment brokers and all that's the financial press, so that they could re-credential the industry. So they wanted my dad to come and run Paramount because the banks had tried to do it, but they didn't know anything about running a movie company. And they thought, well, who would be somebody who's run such a sound financial business during this time in that industry? And it was my dad, even though he'd been in theaters rather than at the studio or, with production, been in exhibition. So they asked him, but he wouldn't do it because he adored Adolf Zucker, and he didn't want to take Zucker's company from him. And they asked him several times, and he said no. And then he got on the train in Chicago on the Super Chief to come to California. And he got on the train, and in his drawing room was Adolf Zucker. And he said, "What are you doing here? Are you going to the coast?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Oh, what are you going for?" He said, "I'm going to take this ride with you because I have to convince you between here and Los Angeles to take the job as president of Paramount." My father said, "Well, I can't do that. I can't take your job. Well, going across country, Zucker convinced him that if he didn't do it, there wasn't going to be any company. And that so it would be a larger favor to him for my dad to take the job than to refuse it. And then they worked out the things that my dad and Zucker felt were right to maintain Mr. Zucker's position and respect and whatever within the company, even though he was not going to be the active day-to-day operating head of the company any longer, how to maintain his image and his contribution to the company as a sort of an ongoing thing. And that was when my dad took the job, it was providing Zucker was made chairman of the board, providing all those things to maintain Mr. Zucker's position in the company. But then he was able to reconstitute the company financially and see that it moved ahead, obviously on a creative basis as well. And then two other very significant things happened. Well, a number of them, but I mean two that come to mind now. One was that in the mid-40s, the antitrust suits had been activated by the government, which were claiming that there was a monopoly in the motion picture industry because individual companies were able to produce, distribute, and exhibit the product, and therefore had a sort of lock on the whole, structure of the industry. And I remember this, endless discussions at the dinner table with different people and whatever about the government's actions. And everybody dreaded it and everybody was fighting it, Paramount as well. Finally, I remember Eric Johnson was head of the Motion Picture Association at that point, and he used to come to dinner often. And I remember finally my father reaching a decision that there was no way that this was not going to happen, that the government was not going to require these companies to split up. And that he had a choice. He could continue to fight it, spending, whatever it cost in those days. We know horrendous amounts of corporate money to fight something that was inevitable. Or he could, adopt the principle that was going to be forced upon them later and start rebuilding the company as two separate companies, which is what he did. A lot of people in the industry were very angry with him. They held out the belief that if he hadn't folded, that they could have fought and won against the government. But I think over time, if you look back at that, seems to be folly. There would have just been a lot more legal bills. Some companies kept fighting, but Paramount didn't, and it split into two companies, and my father made Leonard Goldenson, who had been his assistant originally. He made Leonard Goldenson president of Paramount Theaters, which later, United Paramount Theaters, spinning off that from the production distribution, and strangely enough did not go with the theaters himself, but put Leonard in charge of the theaters. And then Leonard, of course, founded ABC Television, so that was an amazing thing. And that company became highly successful. That was one thing. A second thing that I always think about is television. The advent of television was looming as this sort of, monster around the corner that was going to devour movies, the movie business. And everybody was fighting it and whatever, and it was inevitable. I mean, you could tell it was just the progress was somewhat slow, the investments were whatever. At a given point, my father said to the board of Paramount and the shareholders, this is going to happen, and we might as well be part of it instead of sitting out here flailing like Don Quixote, tilting windmills at something that's going to happen and be very big. And so Paramount invested in Dumont Television. And that was, those were the first sets. I remember we had the first set that anybody we ever knew had, which was a Dumont television set, and it had been partially, developed by Paramount Pictures because he knew that was going to be, he said, we have to find out how to make this a partner, not the enemy, because as the enemy, you can't, the only way you could beat it is to squash it, and we'll never be able to do that. So those were two very important moments at which he, sort of bit the bullet, as it were, of reality, and nonetheless guided the company into things that made it grow, stronger and stronger. Plus, he ran as I said before, he ran a very honest ship about, his sense of fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders.
And so as time went on, did the monster of television actually rock the boat at Paramount under your dad's, supervision?
Well, given that my dad had already vested Paramount into the development of television, so as television grew, you could say, yes, it changed the business, because it did for everybody, and it was going to, whether Paramount had invested in Dumont or not, that was going to happen, and it was going to change the business. The question is how, and could you make that work for you instead of against you? And then there was the deal, I guess, in the early 50s.
I have like 3 more questions.
Yeah.
And the tape is almost over.
Okay.
So would you like some water while we switch
Yeah,
tapes?
it's fine.
Is that right?
Yep,
So,
great. You want to do this?
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. Here.
Yeah. We're almost done. I just
Do
thought
you guys want anything to drink?
I'll take something.
What you like?
I'll,
I'll just
Diet
I'll
Coke,
switch
Sprite.
the-
Coke's fine.
I'll tell them that I
Alcohol,
want
combination, iced tea, lemonade.
Okay.
And if you want one of those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Need a hand?
When he left Paramount and he did different businesses, I don't think he had a lot of contact with Leonard for a long time. And then in the 70s
Yes,
is when my father sort of reconnected with Leonard.
yes, yes.
And I kind of started to know him
Then you
then.
would start to know him then.
And
right.
then I went when I didn't go to Columbia, but I had friends that went to Columbia, and I contacted Leonard, and I did this documentary at Eddie Condon's.
Oh,
in
great.
1979. It was
Yeah.
one of my first projects. And then Leonard played at my wedding. band played it.
Yeah.
And I kind of
Got to know him
the
better,
sound.
yes, yes. So it
Since
wasn't
then-
really when you were growing up. It
No,
was,
no.
you know.
It was more like, and I did go on your
See, because
father's-
I wasn't in New York a lot in those periods. And then the girls met your dad, actually, at
Did
a,
they?
well, at Josie's Thanksgiving thing.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know which one. I know Amy did. Maybe Victoria did too, or maybe Vic wasn't there and Nina was.
We
Or no,
haven't been
I know
doing
my
that.
stepsons. Two of my stepsons were at boarding school in New York, and so they went to Josie's one year.
Mm-hmm.
Josie's in a home, as best I know,
Yeah,
unless.
dude, now Josie was very close to my mother. Even after my father and my mother broke up, they were
Really?
very close. And Josie had Alzheimer's, but Josie and I were very close. Sherry, I've gotten to be close.
Sherry's
in the last,
terrific.
in the last year.
I saw Josie the last time. Mickey and I went. My sister-in-law and I went and had tea with Josie a couple years ago in New York. Or maybe it was
You mean Josie or Cherry, you mean?
no, with Josie
Oh.
before she went into it was just at the end. I knew she was gonna. I talked to Cherry shortly afterwards, and Cherry said it's not going to be long till we have to do something. And I had been up in the apartment. It was very. I mean, I knew she was. You know.
Yeah. But she was very, I mean, Josie and I used to work in the city editing commercials every week, and I would go over to her house and sit with her, and I set up a VCR for her so she could watch movies, and we were very, you know.
Yeah,
she
she was very sweet.
And Sherry and her family was close to my parents when we were all kids. But they
I see, but then they got-
They broke away somehow.
I see.
Tony, her husband's, like, what was her husband's name?
Buddy.
Buddy used to bring his boat to Port Washington, where we lived.
Oh right.
You know, and then they lived in Fieldston, and we lived in Riverdale when we first got married.
Oh, I
We
didn't know
even
that.
know that.
Oh, how wild.
We didn't know that. They lived only like a half a mile from us.
Well, I had a sort of funny thing with Cherry later because when I was married to Don Quine, he was, who I was married to for a very long time. He was my third husband. And his family is from the Isle of Man. Everybody named Quine, it's a Manx name. So everybody named Quine is from the Isle of Man, and they're usually all related somehow, which they can figure out if they sit down long enough and figure it out. Apparently, Buddy and Cherry went to the Isle of
They
Man.
have a house there.
Yeah, they went there years ago and fell in love with it and bought a house there and then spent their summers there. So when Mickey and Leonard's daughter Rachel got married on the East Coast, Cherry and Buddy were there, and Cherry started asking me about Quine, and I told her, you know. So then my husband and Cherry and Buddy got in touch, and they all happened to be he went to the Isle of Man with his mother and sister one year, and then they all met there because Cherry knew his family, and I mean, it was what a strange connection out of, you know.
Especially since
all
it's
of
like half a world away.
Yeah.
You know? And I've been, you know, going to Cherry's house because she has a lot of interesting things, and she's offered to even allow me to use all the materials in the continuous performance book, because that book only tells a portion of the story.
No,
really.
we know.
But by using the materials that are there.
No,
some of
sure,
them
it
are
gives you a
unique.
bounce off of, sure.
So it's, you know, it's been, my kids kind of like, they've like, it's, you know, it's.
Are you saturated with Balaban stuff? It's like
Yeah,
up to here.
People call me on my cell
No
phone.
more Balabans!
This guy from the Chicago Jewish Historical Society called me up on the cell phone, and he's trying to, like, I'm trying to trace the information as far as Israel. Like, I know he was in charge of a synagogue in Chicago, and there's pictures of the synagogue. You know, there's different things. You know, it's just amazing how, you know, all these people are calling me, and it's really
great.
fun, but it's
Overwhelming,
kind of,
yes.
Yeah, no, not overwhelming. I mean, I enjoy it, but it's kind of like you open up the box and it's
I only,
not-
oh, I know.
and
I
love
only
it.
made one documentary in my life, which was
About
sort of
the
a,
prisons.
yeah, it was hard, because we shot in San Quentin for 30 days, and it was probably the most depressing thing
I know.
ever.
I've
Yeah.
done a lot of news in prisons.
Yeah.
But let me just, I have a lot more to tell you too, but
That's fine, yeah.
what, how did, we started to talk about television, and I think we almost finished that question.
Yeah, probably.
But I know that.
Oh, I was going to mention the
oh,
thing about buying about Universal
Right.
and the Paramount films,
Okay.
but I don't have to do that.
Well, you know what? Leonard told a funny story about how your dad was very much into cleaning like a clean, like he, I don't know, his
Yeah.
frame of mind. You know, he was always getting on him to clean his closet,
Yeah.
and that he equated like this, you know, feeling of that of Barney wanting to kind of tidy things up with this whole idea of you know, the he didn't, there wasn't, no one would have anticipated the interest in some of the old films at that time. But I thought it was kind of funny in a way, because you know, you think of your dad and then you with your dad, like the moves that he made affected so much. But how did what was your mom and dad's? I mean, you haven't really spoken much about mom. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about mom? Or
Yeah, my mom was just delicious. She was this very warm, loving, pretty, fun, dear human being. She was the youngest of, my father was the oldest of 10 children. She was the youngest of 10 children. And she was an unwanted child, an unexpected child, an accidental child. I mean, her brothers and sisters were all grown when she was born, so the last thing her parents, who were old and sort of sick and poor, needed was yet another child. So she sort of was born by accident and grew up by accident, very much on her own. And her parents married her off to their doctor, who wanted, you know, said, oh, she's so beautiful, I'd like to marry her. She was about 17 years old or 16 years old. She'd never been out on a date. And they gave her, you know, like a fixed marriage. They gave her to him. He was unfortunately alcoholic and violent and a gambler. He was a doctor, too. So she would take care of the office in the daytime, and then she would rush home at night to fix dinner and things, and he would come in and be very violent. And he would lose all the money gambling, and they had 2 children. And a girl was the older child, and a boy, my brother Bert. And over the years, he got this fixation on the girl child. He would just spoil her. He would take, you know, the money he didn't gamble at the end of the week, he would take and buy some lavish present for this girl child he would never say no to about anything. And he didn't like my mother, and he didn't like my brother, and he was very cruel to them. And finally, my mother couldn't stand it anymore, and she went to an older friend of hers named Dinah Stein, whose son Seymour Stein eventually wound up being the head of brain surgery or neuropsychiatry, something at Cook County, you know, at Chicago University. Very, very prominent doctor. But Dinah Stein was in, this poor woman who had been sort of a friend of my mother's and a friend of her mother's. And she went to Dinah Stein and told her she was being hit and Bert was being hit and whatever. Dinah Stein always said, you have to get a divorce. And my mother had never heard. She didn't know what a divorce was.
okay.
Oh, that's all right. You can close it. Just come on in, honey. But when you're going back out, if you want to go back out, go barefoot through there and go out that door instead of sliding that one. Okay, sweetheart?
Okay. So you were saying about getting divorced.
Yes, so she didn't know what a divorce was, so they explained and whatever. And she did get a divorce, but he wouldn't give her Shirley, the girl. And Shirley didn't want to go with her because, of course, my mother told Shirley to do her homework and do things that she had to get done, and he didn't ever make her do anything. So, of course, Shirley wanted to be with him, and he spoiled her terribly. So my mother left with Bert to get them out and figured she would go back for Shirley. That's what everybody told her to do. And unbeknownst to us, or to my mother, when Shirley got to be a sort of pre-teenager and started to be difficult, or an adolescent and started to be difficult and cross her father on things, he told her to behave herself because he said, your mother doesn't want you, and I didn't want you either, but I agreed to keep you, but if you're not good to me, then I won't keep you either. And Shirley wound up seriously mentally ill. And my mother tried to help her, but then she was totally paranoid about my mother. I mean, it was a horrible thing. It was the bane of my mother's life, really. But my brother Bert was adopted by my dad the minute they got married. And my mother was musical. She sang beautifully. My brother Bert was musical. My brother Leonard, of course, you know. I used to sing. My daughter Amy sings and is a songwriter. My son-in-law, there's a lot of music in our family. But anyway, my mother was just very loving and very sweet, and a woman who was unfortunately, because she hadn't been well educated, even though she was very bright and very sensitive and aware, but she was very conscious, or she felt like she needed, degrees and things, and that she was less than in some ways for not having that in her life. But she was instinctively very bright and very well read and very curious and interested in the world. And she and my father died within 10 months of each other, which is not uncommon with Balaban brothers and their wives. Bert and John died within 10 months of each other, within a year of each other.
And what actors and actresses and people in the entertainment industry did Barney befriend?
My dad and mother were not really friendly with a lot of actors and actresses and a lot of creative people. Mostly it was business people in the entertainment industry and in banking, people in government, people in all sorts of industry. There were very few social contacts between them other than, a studio function or something. They were friendly with the Allen Ladds because Sue Ladd, whose name originally was Sue Carroll, had been a manager of actors and actresses in Chicago from the days when my parents lived in Chicago. So having known Sue from back then, when they all wound up being sort of connected because Alan was at Paramount and Sue was his wife by then, and my parents, the Ladds would visit us in New York, and when we came out here, we would go and visit them at the ranch. So I grew up, too, knowing them and their kids. Myrna Loy came to dinner a few times. Ellen Drew, who was an actress, married a friend of my father's. I can't remember whether she married John Hertz or whether that was Myrna Loy who married John Hertz, but somebody married John Hertz and came. And it would always be through something. My dad didn't really hang out with a lot of artists because, as I said earlier, he didn't really consider himself of that world. He respected it and admired, but he didn't share a lot of the interests of those of people like that because he didn't really think he had that kind of an artistic talent.
The next question is, how did your dad feel about your involvement in the entertainment industry? Not so much as negative or positive, but it's a good opportunity to talk about a little bit about what you've done.
So my parents really didn't have close relationships, not only with actors and actresses, but primarily with writers, directors, and so forth. They knew several of them socially, but they didn't really hang out a lot with them. My father was very involved in his business and his charitable work and a lot of the sort of industries and businesses and government stuff.
I don't think you had a lot of contact with Leonard for a long time, and then in the 70s,
yes,
is when my father sort of reconnected with Leonard.
Yes.
And I kind of started to know him.
Then you would start to know him then.
And then I went when I didn't go to Columbia, but I had friends that went to Columbia, and I contacted Leonard, and I did this documentary at Eddie Condon's.
Oh,
in
great!
1979. It was one of my first projects, and then Leonard played at my wedding.
Oh, wow!
His band played at my wedding, and I kind of
got to know him better. Yes. So it wasn't really when you were growing up. It was.
No. It was more like I did go on. Your
because I wasn't in New York a lot in those periods, and then the girls met your dad actually at Josie's Thanksgiving thing.
Oh yeah.
I don't know which one. I know Amy did. Maybe Victoria did too, or maybe Vic wasn't there and Nina was. Or no, I know my stepsons. Two of my stepsons were at boarding school in New York, and so they went to Josie's one year. Mm-hmm. Josie's in a home, as best I know.
Now Josie was very close to my mother, even after my father and my mother broke up. They were very close, and Josie had Alzheimer's, but Josie and I were very close. Sherry, I've gotten to be close.
Sherry's terrific. I saw Josie the last time Mickey and I went. My sister-in-law and I went and had tea with Josie a couple years ago in New York. Maybe it was
Josie or Cherry. You mean?
No, with Josie before she went into it was just at the end. I knew she was going to. I talked to Cherry shortly afterwards, and Cherry said it's not going to be long till we have to do something. And I had been up in the apartment. It was very. I knew she was.
Yeah. But she was very. Josie and I used to work in the city editing commercials every week, and I would go over to her house and sit with her, and I set up a VCR for her so she could watch movies, and we were very,
Yeah,
she,
she was very sweet.
And Sherry and her family was close to my parents when we were all kids, but
I see, but then they
broke away somehow.
I see.
Tony, her husband's, what was her husband's name?
Buddy.
Buddy used to bring his boat to Port Washington, where we lived.
Oh, right.
And then they lived in Fieldston, and we lived in Riverdale when we first got married.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, how wild.
We didn't know that. They lived only like half a mile from us.
Well, I had a sort of funny thing with Cherry later because when I was married to Don Quine, he was, I was married to for a very long time. He was my third husband. And his family is from the Isle of Man. Everybody named Quine, it's a Manx name. So everybody named Quine is from the Isle of Man, and they're usually all related somehow, which they can figure out if they sit down long enough and figure it out. Apparently, Buddy and Cherry went to the Isle of Man.
They have a house there.
Yeah, they went there years ago and fell in love with it and bought a house there, and then spent their summers there. So when Mickey and Leonard's daughter Rachel got married on the East Coast, Cherry and Buddy were there, and Cherry started asking me about Quine, and I told her, So then my husband and Cherry and Buddy got in touch, and they all happened to be he went to the Isle of Man with his mother and sister one year, and then they all met there because Cherry knew his family, and it was what a strange connection out of,
Especially since
all
it's
of
like half a world away.
Yeah.
And I've been, going to Cherry's house because she has a lot of interesting things, and she's offered to even allow me to use all the materials in the continuous performance book, because that book only tells a portion of the story.
No, we know.
But by using the materials that are there.
No, sure, it gives you a bounce off of, sure.
So it's, it's been, my kids kind of like, they like, it's.
Are you saturated with Balaban stuff? It's like up to here.
People call me on my cell phone.
No more Balabans!
This guy from the Chicago Jewish Historical Society called me up on a cell phone, and he's trying to, I'm trying to trace the information as far as Israel. Like, I know he was in charge of a synagogue in Chicago, and there's pictures of the synagogue. There's different things. It's just amazing how, all these people are calling me, and it's
great.
Really fun, but it's
overwhelming.
Kind of,
yes.
Yeah, no, not overwhelming. I mean, I enjoy it, but it's kind of like you open up the box and it's
I know. I only made one documentary in my life, which was sort of a
prisons.
Yeah, it was hard because we shot in San Quentin for 30 days, and it was probably the most depressing thing ever.
I've done a lot of news in prisons.
Yeah.
But let me just. I have a lot more to tell you too, but
that's fine. Yeah.
What how did we started to talk about television, and I think we almost finished that question.
Yeah, probably.
But I know that.
I was going to mention the thing about buying about Universal
Right.
and the Paramount films,
Okay.
but I don't have to do that.
Well, you know what? Leonard told a funny story about how your dad was very much into cleaning. I don't know, from his frame of mind, he was always getting on him to clean his closet.
Yeah.
And that he equated like this, feeling of Barney wanting to kind of tidy things up with this whole idea of no one would have anticipated the interest in some of the old films at that time. But I thought it was kind of funny in a way because, you think of your dad and then with your dad, like, the moves that he made affected so much, but what was your mom and dad's, you haven't really spoken much about Mom. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about Mom? Or?
Yeah, my mom was just delicious. She was this very warm, loving, pretty, fun, dear human being. She was the youngest my father was the oldest of 10 children. She was the youngest of 10 children. And she was an unwanted child, an unexpected child, an accidental child. Her brothers and sisters were all grown when she was born, so the last thing her parents, who were old and sort of sick and poor, needed was yet another child. So she sort of was born by accident and grew up by accident, very much on her own. And her parents married her off to their doctor, who wanted, said, oh, she's so beautiful, I'd like to marry her. She was about 17 years old or 16 years old. She'd never been out on a date. And they gave her, like a fixed marriage. They gave her to him. He was unfortunately alcoholic and violent and a gambler. He was a doctor, too. So she would take care of the office in the daytime, and then she would rush home at night to fix dinner and things, and he would come in and be very violent. And he would lose all the money gambling, and they had 2 children. And a girl was the older child, and a boy, my brother Bert. And over the years, he got this fixation on the girl child. He would just spoil her, where he would take, the money he didn't gamble at the end of the week, he would take and buy some lavish present for this girl child he would never say no to about anything. And he didn't like my mother, and he didn't like my brother, and he was very cruel to them. And finally, my mother couldn't stand it anymore, and she went to an older friend of hers named Dinah Stein, whose son Seymour Stein eventually wound up being the head of brain surgery or neuropsychiatry, something at Cook County, at Chicago University. Very, very prominent doctor. But Dinah Stein was in this poor woman who had been sort of a friend of my mother's and a friend of her mother's. And she went to Dinah Stein and told her she was being hit and Bert was being hit and whatever. Dinah Stein, we said, you have to get a divorce. And my mother had never heard. She didn't know what a divorce was.
Okay.
Oh, that's all right. You can close it. Just come on in, honey. But when you're going back out, if you want to go back out, go barefoot through there and go out that door instead of sliding that one. Okay, sweetheart?
Okay. So you were saying about getting divorced.
Yes, so she didn't know what a divorce was, so they explained and whatever. And she did get a divorce, but he wouldn't give her Shirley, the girl. And Shirley didn't want to go with her because, of course, my mother told Shirley to do her homework and do things that she had to get done. And he didn't ever make her do anything. So, of course, Shirley wanted to be with him, and he spoiled her terribly. So my mother left with Bert to get them out and figured she would go back for Shirley. That's what everybody told her to do. And unbeknownst to us, or to my mother, when Shirley got to be a sort of pre-teenager and started to be difficult, or an adolescent and started to be difficult and cross her father on things, he told her to behave herself because he said, your mother doesn't want you, and I didn't want you either, but I agreed to keep you. But if you're not good to me, then I won't keep you either. And Shirley wound up seriously mentally ill. And my mother tried to help her. By then she was totally paranoid about my mother. I mean, it was a horrible thing. It was the bane of my mother's life, really. But my brother Bert was adopted by my dad the minute they got married. And my mother was musical. She sang beautifully. My brother Bert was musical. My brother Leonard, of course, I used to sing. My daughter Amy sings and is a songwriter. My son-in-law, there's a lot of music in our family. But anyway, my mother was just very loving and very sweet, and a woman who was, unfortunately, because she hadn't been well educated, even though she was very bright and very sensitive and aware, but she was very conscious, or she felt like she needed, degrees and things, and that she was less than in some ways for not having that in her life. But she was instinctively very bright and very well read and very curious and interested in the world. And she and my father died within 10 months of each other, which is not uncommon with Balaban brothers and their wives. Bert and John died within 10 months of each other, within a year of each other.
And what actors and actresses and people in the entertainment industry did Barney befriend?
My dad and mother were not really friendly with a lot of actors and actresses and a lot of creative people. Mostly it was business people in the entertainment industry and in banking, people in government, people in all sorts of industry. There were very few social contacts between them other than, a studio function or something. They were friendly with the Allen Ladds because Sue Ladd, whose name originally was Sue Carroll, had been a manager of actors and actresses in Chicago from the days when my parents lived in Chicago. So having known Sue from back then, when they all wound up being sort of connected because Alan was at Paramount and Sue was his wife by then, and my parents, the lads would visit us in New York, and when we came out here, we would go and visit them at the ranch. So I grew up too, knowing them and their kids. Myrna Loy came to dinner a few times. Ellen Drew, who was an actress, married a friend of my father's. I can't remember whether she married John Hertz or whether that was Myrna Loy who married John Hertz, but somebody married John Hertz and came. And it would always be through something. My dad didn't really hang out with a lot of artists because, as I said earlier, he didn't really consider himself of that world. He respected it and admired, but he didn't share a lot of the interests of those of people like that because he didn't really think he had that kind of an artistic talent. This.
The next question is, how did your dad feel about your involvement in the entertainment industry? Not so much as negative or positive, but it's a good opportunity to talk about a little bit about what you've done.
So my parents really didn't have close relationships, not only with actors and actresses, but primarily with writers, directors, and so forth. They knew several of them socially, but they didn't really hang out a lot with them. My father was very involved in his business and his charitable work and a lot of the sort of industries and businesses and government stuff that came into his daily life because of being at Paramount the way he was. When I got to be about 16, I graduated high school at 16, and then I went to college for a year, and then I wanted to quit college and go to work. And I did. And I went to work in the fashion business because I wanted to act, but my father did not want me to act. He was, I think, very frightened of, first of all, remember that in those days, acting was not, I always say when people talk to me about Grace Kelly in those days and our friendship and how people felt about her, and when she was marrying Prince Rainier, I always say you have to remember in a certain part of society in those days, acting was second only to street walking. It was a very noble profession. The world is very different now, thank goodness. But I think my father was also very worried, knowing the kind of rejection and difficulty and kind of ups and downs of a life geographically, financially, all the rest of it in being in the arts. So I had been a singer, I had been a dancer, and I was acting, and he wasn't thrilled about all of that. But I did eventually quit my job in the fashion business and start acting and singing. And he was fine about that, but then later, when I think we have to stop for a second, don't we?
Yeah, could you just tell them to be quiet for like 5 more minutes? We have one more question. Thanks. I would just go back a second.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Thanks, Dan. All right. We're clear again.
So my father wasn't enthused about the idea of my, acting or singing or dancing as a profession. I think they're still at it.
Just tell them that it's really literally just don't. If you could just not.
Yeah,
if you just whisper for like 5 more minutes, then we'll help.
Or they can go in the other house or around the other side or somewhere.
Right next to the building too. Just like 5 more minutes, just whisper.
Whispering, guys.
How are you gonna get that TV home on your bike?
Same way I got it here.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Danny. So I was saying my father wasn't enthused about the idea of my acting, singing, or dancing as a career because he worried about, I guess, the stability of such things. But I did ultimately start doing that, but not for a very long time before I met and became engaged to Jay Cantor, who was at that time a leading agent at MCA. I had gone with already Merv Griffin and Montgomery Clift. My father introduced me to Montgomery Clift, but he was hoping we would become friends, but he didn't ever think that we would be going out, and he was not happy about that. And my father was very intent upon my marrying somebody who was Jewish. which was very important to him. Not only because his Judaism was very important to him, which it really was, but I think also he had recollections from his own childhood of very, painful anti-Semitism, which I, of course, had never encountered because I was raised in a whole different universe, one that he had created, really, and a whole different time. So I was not as sensitive about that as he was. But in any case, then our house, when we'd go up, Jay and I would go for the summers to my parents' house in Rye and stay over, and Jay would commute to the office in New York with Dad on the train. But by then, that house was filled with actors and actresses and writers and directors and songwriters and so forth, because Jay and I were very involved in a universe in New York in which most of our friends were, either from motion picture industry or television or Broadway theater, very, major leading celebrities, or people who were then new and young who became major leading celebrities in life later on. And that was fine. I mean, my father was fine with all those people. He enjoyed them and whatever. It's just that they were our friends whom he was then entertaining at the house as part of a life with us, rather than people he had sought out on his own when he was there, when he was our age.
And how do you feel that? What do you think? How do you think your dad should be remembered?
My dad had very little concern or desire for fame, personal fame. Yeah.
I have this amazing film clip that I want to share with you of your dad giving this address in the Paramount office.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's like, and now a message from Barney Balaban, and you have like him sitting there, and he's like, it was like before, I guess before that, now you will see that, and like it's like a corporate message, but this was like so long ago, and
it was a unique thing. Yeah.
It was cool. All right, so
okay, about how he should be remembered. My dad, unlike a lot of people in the business then and now, my dad had very little, and a lot of people in business now in general, but my dad had very little desire, interest, or care for the notion of personal publicity or fame or whatever. He was a person very much motivated by his own sense of right and wrong and integrity and responsibility and whatever. He's a fairly serious fellow. Fun, liked to laugh and do all that, but I mean, he took life fairly seriously. And he was not one for much self-aggrandizement. I'm sure he was pleased when people made something of it, but he was modest, basically. He was a modest person, basically. And so when I think of him, apart from the part that's so personal as my dad, and of course loving and remembering him for those great gifts that, a parent can give to a child personally, and the hassles we had sometimes when I was in my teenage years and very rebellious. I guess the thing that when I think back on him, the two most valuable and treasured aspects of him that I think of as a human being, and it would apply both to, his home life and his outer life, would be his sense of principle and integrity and responsibility, and his love of his country, and his sense of what an active and responsible citizen does. And I didn't always agree, perhaps, with what he did, or he might not agree with what I did, I don't know. But the point is that he was an American citizen in a very specific and wonderful way. And he was a responsible steward of a public company in a very responsible and commendable way. And those two things, and he built a very, he was a pioneer in a very fabulous industry that grew out of, from the early days of his and others pioneering in it. And it's amazing when you think of it today, you know, with revolving heads of companies and whatever, that he was almost 30 years president of Paramount Pictures. Through great many changes that he, you know, shepherded the studio through very, very successfully. So I guess those are the principal things that I would think, you know, commend him to memory in a very favorable light.
One final question. What are you most proud of about being a Balaban?
Well, I guess I'm most proud of being a Balaban. My immediate Balaban, of course, connections are to my own parents. And since they were both such good human beings, basically, in very different ways. My mother, much less sophisticated than my father about so many things of the business world and all of that, but such a lovely, warm, good human being, and such a generous hostess and mother and friend and whatever. You know, I think of my gifts from them that are personal gifts, that whatever. But I think there's a genuine sense of respect for the history and the lore of this family, in which so many people, even in that one generation, you know, actively involved in a business together, helped to position something that became such a, you know, leading industry and art form and means of communication for people all over the world. And I think the heritage is part of being that, and part of also a close sense of family, because for all the times when anybody was arguing with anybody else or whatever, there's a very strong sense of Balabanism amongst us, those of us who know each other and those of us who don't, you know. So I think my sense is of strong family, of community, of communal and family effort and accomplishment where possible, and a sort of loving sense of community as a family group, no matter where we are and when we are and how we are, and a sense that the people who were part of us did something quite extraordinary in the 20th century.
Well, that's great, Judy. And is there anything that I didn't touch on that you...
No, there's a million stories, but
Okay.
you know, you could be here for 6 months.
Is there any, like, okay. Well, I think
Does that work for you?
yeah,
Okay.
I think that is very excellent.